evening. Hi, thank you for joining us. My name is Daisy Gould. I'm a PhD student here at the Courtauld, and I have the immense pleasure of introducing Professor Marsha Pearce. First, a huge thank you to the Manton Center for British Art team for everything that you've done to make this possible, as well as Professor Dorothy Price, Executive Dean and Deputy Director of the Courtauld, without whom this event would not be happening. A bit of housekeeping. Please ensure that your mobile phones are off or on silent. First, Professor Pearce will present her talk titled Home on the Waves, Museum Collections and Caribbean Tidalectics, and after which we will open it up to a few audience questions. So without further ado, Professor Marsha Pearce is a British Academy Global Professor at the Fitzwilliam Museum. Her current research project is titled Trembling Abode, Reimagining the Museum as Home for Global Majority Artists. This work considers issues of belonging and agency and nurtures academic and creative relationships between the UK and the Caribbean. It applies Caribbean-rooted philosophies across 4 research pillars: acquisitions, artist residencies, curation, and public engagement. Professor Pearce holds a PhD in Cultural Studies and a bachelor's degree in Visual Arts, both from the University of West Indies, or UWI. She has taught in the Visual Arts Unit at UWI for over a decade and worked as unit coordinator from 2018 to 2022. She also held the role of Deputy Dean of Distance and Outreach at the UWI Faculty of Humanities and Education. She has served on the board of the National Museum and Art Gallery of Trinidad and Tobago, and as a consultant for the Draft National Policy on Culture and Arts of Trinidad and Tobago. She has also worked as an Assistant Chief Examiner for Caribbean Studies, offered as part of the Caribbean Examinations Council program administered across the Caribbean. Her curatorial projects include a collaboration with the National Portrait Gallery here in London and the British Council for Americas in Britain, the Caribbean Edition online exhibition project, and her work with the Perez Art Museum Miami to co-curate a group show, The Other Side of Now, four-sided contemporary Caribbean art. She has contributed chapters to books on Caribbean studies, art education, therapeutic cultures, diaspora studies, and travel and tourism. Her commissioned essays are featured in several exhibition catalogs, contemporary art survey publications, and artist monograph. Please join me in welcoming Professor Marsha Pearce.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Daisy. And a huge thank you to Daisy and Professor Price for organizing this event, and to Alice Rafter and team for their thoughtful handling of logistics. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I'm delighted to have you join me. I'm going to show a video, and I don't want us to assume we know its content. I'm encouraging us to really look and listen. That was recorded almost 2 weeks ago at Maracas Beach on the northern coast of Trinidad. This beach is approximately an hour's drive from the island's capital city of Port of Spain and is arguably the most popular bay in Trinidad. The video, with its image and sound, is this evening's prologue. It sets the tone for reflections on the sea, not as tropical cliché, not as a tourist escape, but as philosophy and methodology. I want to begin at the end, which is to say at the beginning. That is the end, which is to say the beginning. That is the end. That is the beginning. I'm talking in circles here, not as riddle, not to confuse you, but rather as a way of recognizing both limits and openings, as a way of resisting fixed systems. My utterances take the shape of wavelengths, echoing the sea. In thinking about the Caribbean, the late Barbadian poet Edward Kamau Brathwaite describes a moment of revelation. He recalls staying at a humble house on a cliff overlooking the sea. Each morning, he observes an old woman sweeping sand from the house. For him, it is a curious labor, because she's sweeping away what is sure to return. The wind always carries sand into homes near the beach. In one sense, we might see the woman's act as one of resistance, a fight against relentless conditions. Yet, it is when Brathwaite shifts his perspective that we get a more nuanced picture of her daily efforts. He writes, quote, "One morning I see her body silhouetting against the sparkling light that hits the Caribbean at that early dawn, and it seems as if her feet, which all along I thought were walking on the sand, were really walking on the water." End quote. The ocean's horizon line meets cliff top, and the ground beneath the old woman is now perceived as fluid. Brathwaite explains that he saw her as traveling, as always on this journey, as constantly coming from one shore to another. This, for Brathwaite, is an image of Caribbean experience, and he uses it to frame a Caribbean logic. In contrast to Western dialectic reasoning, which seeks to resolve clashing viewpoints, to settle ideas that are in tension, Brathwaite speaks about a tidalectic, tide plus dialectic. That is, a Caribbean way of being that holds contrasts and paradoxes, refusing to settle or be fixed. The Caribbean exists in flux. It is a liquid ontology, a space alive with tensions, churning with despair and hope, destruction and creativity, backward and forward motions, emigrating and immigrating, arriving and departing, a people moving with a tidalectic sensibility like that old woman walking on water. A people walking on water, as Brathwaite describes, quote, "coming from one continent or continuum, touching another, and then receding from the islands into the perhaps creative chaos of their future." End quote. Caribbean people have made their home in this marine rhythm, which is to say that our psychology lives in it. But there is more for us to understand about homemaking in Brathwaite's vision of that old woman. He makes no further mention of her tidying ritual, but I imagine that he sees her no longer cleaning up sand, but sweeping the waves. This is an important detail because it is in this interpretation that it is possible to read her broom as awe. Now, for me, the old woman is not only moving with the water, but stirring its surface, creating her own ripples and establishing her agency and presence. Each sweeping gesture is a declaration, I am here. And this self-assertion matters for a people with a colonial past characterized by a denial of selves. The act of nurturing selfhood is a perpetual endeavor in a bid to feel at home in our own skins. It is a wave action, a move of the tides within us. Brathwaite's intellectual work provides a useful framework for thinking about home and selves in transit. By introducing his ideas here and interweaving my own reflections, my opening paragraphs serve to build context. See my sentences, therefore, like the rise and swell of a wave gathering energy as it goes across open waters. But I want to come to shore now to let my words break on the coastline between what is theorized and what is practiced, to have Brathwaite's concepts meet the artworks made by 7 creative practitioners who have moved in and out of the Caribbean region, living, studying, and working across Trinidad, the United States of America, England, and Germany. Earlier this year, I curated the exhibition, By These Shores I Was Born. The show was installed at Y Art Gallery in Trinidad. The show's title is borrowed from Kamau Brathwaite's poem South, published in Rites of Passage in 1967, Brathwaite's first book in his trilogy, The Arrivals. It is a significant poetic series that sheds light on the transatlantic flow of people, an exploration of identity and sensations of belonging. South invites thoughts about home and migration and feelings of longing and joy, with the narrative voice in the poem shifting from the Caribbean to lands of the North and back again. Brathwaite expresses, and I quote, "By these shores I was born, sound of the sea came in at my window. Life heaved and breathed in me then with the strength of that turbulent soil." Each artist in the exhibition claimed the I in the show's title to reflect on their experiences and understanding of home. It is noteworthy that these artists are millennials, individuals born between 1981 and 1996. They witnessed the rise of the information age and internet and constitute the first generation to be raised with smartphones and social networking. Given their deep embeddedness in a highly connected world supported by digital technology, millennials are considered to be global and borderless in their outlook. How then do they make sense of their place in a broad terrain? This is Giovanna Hadid's Sound of the Sea, an installation of a scale of 5 meters by 3 meters, or roughly 16 feet by 8 feet. Sound of the Sea is a translation of the toughness of steel into delicate, airy seafoam, which at first glance appears as a page in an atlas. Metal fragments are charted like land masses, and soldering joints make circular impressions that read as dots, cities, or pinpointed geographic locations. Yet, if we look again, what Hadid offers rather is a cartography of water, a steady and sensitive depiction of ocean currents as they swirl, seethe, and surge. There is no resolution here, no final dialectic outcome. We are called home to the contradictions of turbulence and tenderness, the cool of metal and the heat of their burnt edges. We are asked to dwell in the highs and lows of an undulating picture. All is tidal here, and in between the planar shifts of steel, memory dissipates and is held. This work, however, does not stay at the level of visual sensation. Hadid maps a melody. Light strikes steel like a musician playing a steel pan. If we listen, we can hear cells forged in the sweat of cane fields and in the glow of flambeau carrying working class people who take to the streets in joyous, defiant carnival procession. Cells born out of a sea of Caribbean history. If we listen, we can hear a steel orchestra. Hadid's etching on paper, titled Colonies of Coral, attends to surface and depth. She portrays coral seaweed found at the shores of Balandra Beach, Trinidad. The algae are a metaphor for a to and fro motion, a tension of directions on a journey that requires going the distance. They are emblematic of what emerges and what stays hidden in a continuous cycle of rooting ourselves. Shannon Alonso's watercolor paintings lend their own fluidity. Grounding explores her attachment to place with an image of inviting encounters. Land meets water, sky connects with earth, and the urban is put in dialogue with the natural world. Dense mangrove roots suggest a sense of being planted, but their fixity is disrupted by their transformation. Their tubular forms disappear in Alonso's liquid gestures and reappear as suspended feet. Instead of stasis, she renders the arc, flex, and twist of limbs to present us with a locomotive energy. In their suspension, any final destination or fixed truth of locatedness is always postponed. These feet are not walking on sand, to return to Brathwaite's view of the old woman. They remind us that homemaking is an ongoing series of movements that is in and of water, as luminously described by Alonso's application and treatment of water-soluble pigments. This destabilization of being grounded is heightened by her incorporation of an embroidered element, a running stitch that takes our thoughts from roots to roots. Lines of thread read as paths, migration flows. The idea of ground and landform is also reimagined in Alonso's portrayal of mountains as electrical poles and power lines. She considers Trinidad's mountain range as a natural embrace and puts this in exquisite tension with the city's high voltage network. Home is both caress and current, and within this composition of tensions is a very present self. The specialized roots of mangrove swarms extend above ground and are considered breathing roots. They can therefore be seen as the lungs in a painted torso that bridges fluid feet at one end and necks that crane upward with post-colonial ambitions on the other. Selfhood is centered more explicitly in Alonso's Cradle Song. In this work, her self-portrait are presented as mirror images. Yet one figure's eyes are closed and the other faces us with eyes open. Alonso plays with conscious and subconscious states of being, where acts of dwelling, as understood, as we saw before in Hadid's art, are as much about awareness as they are about what we carry beneath the surface, beliefs, memories, and past experiences. She weaves hair with foliage, wire fences, and power lines to give us a rich poetics of relation. She extends this presentation of touch points with the inclusion of torn paper, which she layers sensitively to address edges, disjuncture, and seams. Similarly, Simone Kennedy Doig finds home in the dialectic of relationships. How to reconcile the well-being we experience within the bustle of a pub and the comfort we feel at the sight of trees, sea, and horizon. Answers swirl with watery definition. Kennedy Doig draws us into a simultaneity of presence by asking us to straddle human and more than human worlds. In Brooklyn Bar at Night, Three Graces, she depicts Carib girls, a local term in Trinidad for women who work as brand ambassadors for the Carib Beer Company. Kennedy Doig paints them dressed in yellow gold strappy tops. In contrast, her piece titled Two Visitors, Port of Spain, features yellow-breasted Kiskadee birds. The bar is a familiar, universal place. For Kennedy Doig, it is a personal reference point, a homing device that guides her again and again each time she relocates. It is a recurring motif in her art practice, circling like a wave between Malaccas Bay at Trinidad's north coast and Burling Gap in East Sussex, England. For Brooklyn Bar at Night, Three Graces, she relies on memory and art history. She connects the dots between her experiences of a local bar in the Caribbean and the repeated representation of a female figure in Europe's art canon, the Three Graces, known in Greek mythology as the daughters of Zeus, and as symbolic of beauty and charm. If we are to take up residence anywhere, Kennedy Doig understands that we must unpack our bags at the overlap of myth and reality. Two Visitors, Port of Spain, is a view from her mother's balcony at Fonzamans in the hills of St. Anne's, Trinidad. She gives us her perspective overlooking the Queen's Park Savannah in the island's capital city. This image is her beacon, her way back and forth between archipelago and continent. When she sees the Kiskadee, she thinks of her mom. There is attention to perspective in work by Stanton Taylor, whose childhood was characterized by several moves within Trinidad before leaving the island to live and work abroad. He now works in Germany. His treatment of vantage points, however, is one of oscillation between the familiar and the unknown. For him, home is both a remembering and a forgetting, as he has little memories of his early surroundings. To attend to these gaps and silences, he turns to Google Maps satellite images, a bird's eye view of his previous home addresses. His piece, Perspective Study, Dabity, begins with a top-down screenshot of a location in East Trinidad. Taylor then creates waves, rippling the surface of the image by introducing various perspective grids. He experiments with vanishing points, orthogonal lines, and horizons, not to give us spatial accuracy, but rather to distort and to disorient. Axes do not align and one point evades another. This is a remembering process, a piecing together of then and now, here and there, in a geometric configuration of what is recognizable and what does not make sense. The trapezoid shape at the center of the piece is a clever nod to the technique of foreshortening to raise matters of distance and depth. That is, what is emotionally near and far, what is within reach for the artist and what remains ungraspable, what has personal dimension and what feels flattened or leveled like an emptied cache. Overall, Taylor's composition of nested frames, rectangles within rectangles, is an optical dance that takes our eyes in and out with the tide. Distortion and unfamiliarity are also features of Rodel Warner's video works, which add new iterations to his ongoing series, Artificial Archive. Warner confronts archival biases and narrow visual representations that feed colonial legacies of self-alienation and amnesia. Do we see ourselves in historical records? Is it a self we know, or are we strangers in a steady flow and circulation of media? How are we defined? What aspects of us are amplified, invented, erased? Warner uses moving images to animate these questions. Most powerfully, he resists the archive's fiction with his own imaginative conjuring. Working in dialogue with artificial intelligence, he prompts text-to-image generators to construct visuals that make a temporal jump from the past to the future. He projects us into the spaces of Trinidad Carnival Monday and Tuesday in the year 2126, 100 years from now. We must consider what home means in and over time, and whether belonging rests in the meeting place of human memory and machine code. Perhaps home is both within artifice and artifact, in what we hold as truth, in what we make, and what remains. Warner brings us face to face with our dreams and distrust as we view images of masquerade revelers who advance and retreat within an aqueous solution of people and places. And as I said, so this is a video, moving images, and you're seeing bodies moving in and out. In Artificial Archive Carnival Fiction's Home, 2126 Monday, bodies turn toward each other with an intimacy that ignores our presence as onlookers. Flesh morphs and contorts, collapsing into loops and curls. The gaze is different in Artificial Archive Carnival Fiction's Home, 2126 Tuesday. Masqueraders acknowledge us. There is a more explicit sense of looking into a mirror, but the reflections are ever migrating. Viewing these videos through a ship's porthole gives emphasis to travel, unsettling the gallery floor beneath our feet, while fishing net edges splay like surf between lingering yesterdays and invented tomorrows. And so visitors to the gallery were treated to seeing those videos through portholes that we created around those images. To this, Warner injects a sonic layer, a slowed tenor pan solo, which creates a meditative, haunting atmosphere, or to be more specific, a hauntology, where the ghosts of alternative futures and the specters of the past can influence our present being. Like Warner, fictions are a focal point in the installation by Felicia Carinage, who uses small wooden benches, typically found at German hardware stores, as a canvas. This piece of furniture echoes the pira, a tiny bench found in homes in Trinidad. Carinage remembers her father would sit on one to do his work. To these pinewood objects, she applies a painterly style that is reminiscent of the covers of the travel and adventure novels by German author Karl May. In several of his books, he writes about Winnetou, a fictional indigenous American character set within the romanticized landscapes of the American West. May's Winnetou stories fed a constructed fantasy of Indianness, savage, primitive, and were interpreted and welcomed by Nazi Germany for their colonialist ideals. Carinage, an artist of Indian heritage, looks for herself in May's literature and reads his depiction of otherness as a violent erasure. Her artworks wrestle with what it means to be domiciled in exoticism. She paints landscapes with no human figures to highlight ideas of absence and presence. On her bench titled The Chute, her image of a vibrant canyon is uninhabited. And for On the Tranquil Ocean, which you saw in the previous slide, she pictures a vacant beach. And for The Treasure of Silver Lake, a canoe floats without a paddler. She then deconstructs these benches, taking them apart as a material act of analyzing identity. Bench seats and legs, now separated, are reinterpreted as books and placed on a shelf as part of a domestic scene, complete with a rocking chair. There we go. And you can see on the floating shelf there, those benches are deconstructed and they've been placed next to some of those Karl May books. The chair's implied motion disrupts a static representation of being. Carinage finds herself rocking like sea waves between ideas of the indigenous American and the West Indian, a misnomer by Christopher Columbus, who after arriving in the Caribbean assumed he had reached India. Her movement is a refusal of agreement. While Carinage attends to erasure, Ryan Huggins considers home in terms of existential validation. Through the medium of oil paint, he vividly recalls a sky bar, a space active in the early 2000s and a contributor to the nightlife and energy that typified Trinidad's Aripita Avenue. For Huggins, the bar signifies safety, personal freedom, and an affirmation of queer authenticity. Sky Bar opened my eyes to being my real self in a confident way, he shares. It showed me how much more there was to life than what I thought I was on the inside. Again, we see a theme of what can lay submarine and what can bubble to the surface. The artist underscores this awareness of an interiority and an exteriority of being by offering us two vistas of the bar. We get a low-angle perspective in his painting, Sky Bar, Exterior, and there's a feeling of power and anticipation from this point of view, one that grows and rushes into new beginnings in Sky Bar, Huggins' painting of an inside scene. In this image, the fluid dynamics are palpable. Heteronormative, binary traditions are eroded by waves of bodies in blissful action, from the flirtatious snap of a handheld fan to the gyration of one hip on another and couples dancing in each other's arms. The mood is warm and passionate. Amid this scene of recreation, Huggins makes a critical intervention. By including Trinidad and Tobago's national flag and the pride flag, you can see those in the top right there. He draws us to the nature of shifting tides in an island nation that decriminalized consensual same-sex relations in 2018, and then, through a Court of Appeal ruling in 2025, reinstated the illegality of such acts, holding firm to colonial-era laws. His journeys, therefore, between Trinidad's conservatism and the state's advocacy of LGBTQ+ human rights in Germany, where he lives and makes his art, are propelled by memories of Sky Bar kept afloat. The bar is a space of awakening to the possibilities or limitless morning of the self. And yet, with all the tensions we carry in the Caribbean, Kamau Brathwaite writes with elation about a return to the islands. And I'm quoting again from that poem, South, which I used as a framework for the exhibition. Brathwaite says, on a return, small urchins combing the beaches look up from their traps to salute us. They remember us just as we left them. The fisherman hawking the surf on this side of the reef stands up in his boat and hellos us. A starfish lies in its pool, and gulls, white sails slanted seaward, fly into the limitless morning before us. Through a display of new artworks, the artist and By These Shores I Was Born revealed the nuances of walking on water, adding hue and texture to Brathwaite's image of the old woman at that house on the cliff. They show us how to navigate home on the waves, to dwell on bird selves constantly in the swash and backwash of our complex contemporary lives. And yet there is more we might learn from the aesthetic engagements, particularly how a tidalectic ontology in art might be translated to museology. I'm thinking about museum practices. What does it mean to be at home in a museum collection? How might museums rethink collecting practices in ways that are more inclusive? I can feel another wave coming. Water that moves to the shore always recedes, returning seaward only for new waves to curl and crest to the continuous action. That moment when the tide ebbs or retreats is just as special as when water touches land, for it is in the ebb current that you can find what you might not have seen before. Catch sight of mussels, crabs, and small fish. Quickly now, before the next wave, gather what you can from the shoreline, an idea, a feeling, your own observations. Going in for the next wave. This wave begins as care understood in one sense. The care of an artwork in a museum collection. But all sea waves transform as they build, absorbing energy from the wind and changing shape as the water moves against the seafloor. This wave is no different. As this cycle of ideas unfolds here, I will reframe the notion of care to offer a different way of seeing and in turn a different way of doing. In October last year, I had the privilege of participating in a curatorial forum organized by the British Art Network and Yale Center for British Art. The forum provided exceptional access to institutional collections and behind-the-scenes tours in New York and New Haven, Connecticut. There were many memorable moments, but what is most relevant for my discussion this evening is the session on art conservation. which was led by Jessica David, Head of Paintings Conservation, and Kendall Francis, Assistant Paintings Conservator, both working at the Yale Center for British Art, a public museum with the largest collection of British art outside the United Kingdom. David and Francis gave insights to the processes involved in restoring a 16th century painting, including their collaboration with specialists at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. The work is titled An Allegory of the Tudor Succession, the Family of Henry VIII. It is a panel painting where pigment has been applied to wood rather than canvas or paper. This image was done on an oak panel comprising 5 boards. The painting needed much care in what would take almost 3 years of restoration. There were signs of paint loss and discoloration on the surface, and the panel had begun to come apart at the joins. There were gaps. The conservation team explained that they learned the painting had undergone copious restorations. At the back of the painting, they found horizontal battens and thinner wood strips that were added in a previous restoration. These were placing stress on the original oak construction, stress caused by a difference in material. To use their words, the battens were made from a tropical hardwood which behaves differently from the 5 horizontally grained Baltic oak boards that make up the panel. The conservation effort required a careful sourcing of wood, dated at the same time or near the age of the oak panels, to create a revised system of support. They also undertook a texturing process to ensure similarities between the physical properties of the existing oak and the new additions. They wanted conformity, or as they shared, they wanted the panels they incorporated to behave like the existing ones. They did not want the panel painting to warp. These intricate details matter. The work of cleaning, retouching, and repairing structural damage is part of a vital conservation campaign that treats the stability of a painting's form, thereby supporting its longevity. Yet I argue that the museum practice of collecting needs an unconservative campaign, one that is less concerned with stabilization. In addressing gaps in representation and the imperial epistemic damage that are still evident in institutional collections, repair work cannot be synonymous with fixing things. Repair work needs to be tidal. We need museum collections to warp. We need the waves in museum collections. Curator Stephanie Sparling-Williams notes that it is not enough to, quote, add and stir previously omitted artworks into existing organizing schemas, end quote. Her use of the term add and stir underscores the way in which artworks can be called in to mix, blend, and integrate into a system, ultimately without changing that system. Veronica Pezan puts it this way, explaining that reshaping museum collections is a decolonization process that, quote, requires more than simply adding new voices or objects. It demands a fundamental rethinking of how museums represent history, culture, and identity, end quote. Again, this speaks to structural transformation, to structural shifts. Reflecting on collections and the work of museums, art historian and deputy director of the Guggenheim, Naomi Beckwith, talks about a shift, quote, from diversity work, which is just get more in, to equity work, which is about restructuring how we think and how we function, end quote. Work which she insists must be an ongoing project. We need different actions in and upon museum collections. Unlike the efforts to match behavior in the restoration of a panel painting, museum collections need behavioral dissonance. We need all systems to be under productive stress, to undergo the erosive and creative force of wave action, breaking down sedimentary beliefs and building up dynamic ridges of meaning. And yes, this must be ongoing dialectic work that holds the tension of cresting and crashing waves. I want to invoke the painting of An Allegory of the Tudor Succession as a metaphor. It is useful to think about its oak panels and those battens made of tropical hardwood in terms of enduring systems and the behavior that agitates them. When we look at the history of European empires, specifically during what is known as the Age of Sail, between the 16th and 19th centuries, we find that the British Navy used oak trees primarily to build their ships for maritime exploration and conquest. Oak from the Baltic region was heavily traded for this purpose, when demand exceeded domestic supply. Simon Holloway of England's Forestry Commission tells us that the Navy began planting oak trees to keep the momentum of shipbuilding to expand the British Empire. Britannia ruled the waves thanks largely to the mighty oak, says journalist Stephen Thorne. It took about 4,000 oak trees to build a single 100-gun ship of the line. In this 18th century illustration, we see a mature oak tree standing at the center with a fleet of naval ships in the background. At the foot of the tree sits Britain personified. Her shield emblazoned with the Union Jack rests at her side. In her right hand, she holds an oak seedling. The banner across the top of the image reads, Britain's glory and protection. Tropical flora also take center stage in images that give us a different perspective on a story about empire. They participate in a picture of resistance. I refer to the Haitian Revolution initiated by many and led by formerly enslaved Toussaint Louverture and Jean-Jacques Dessalines, a key moment in world and Caribbean histories, with Haiti serving as a site of revolutionary insurrection and becoming the first Black republic in the world. The 19th century painting Battle for Palm Tree Hill by Polish artist and army officer January Suchodolski features the trunks and leaves of the palm plant as anchor and buttress for men determined to fight for their freedom. The painting depicts a clash between Haitian people and Polish soldiers who were serving the French. Haitian painter Madsen Montpremier gives his own visual account of the rebellion and its outcome, with a tree as a focal point. This image, titled Dessalines Ripping the White from the Flag, shows Jean-Jacques Dessalines tearing the white band from the French tricolor, symbolizing the rejection of French colonial rule and white supremacy. And it's interesting to note here that yesterday, May 18th, was Haitian Flag Day. At the lower right of the image, Catherine Flon, identified in several accounts as the goddaughter of Dessalines, is seen sewing the remaining blue and red bands together to craft the new nation's symbol. Her presence acknowledges the role of women in rebellions in the Americas. Near her seated form, we see the dynamic posture of a tree with multiple breasts as a symbolic reinforcement of female energy and a sign of national fecundity. This tree also echoes the mapu, a tropical tree understood in Haitian culture and voodoo practice as representing power and a dwelling place for spirits. The tree can be regarded in terms of the potomitan, that is, the pillar or axis that acts as a sacred conduit in voodoo ceremonies for drawing strength and guidance from a metaphysical dimension. Tropical trees show up in narratives of defiance and resilience in other ways. Enslaved Africans who escaped plantations set up autonomous communities in mountains and forested areas. These unruly fugitives were given the name Maroons. The Accompong Maroon settlement still exists today in St. Elizabeth Parish, Jamaica. The kinder or mangowood tree is a hardwood variety that holds significance. It is said that Maroon leaders such as Cujo held meetings under this tree to discuss countermeasures against the British. To think, therefore, about a tropical wood like the kinder in relation to oak is to apply a liberatory misbehavior or action that goes against the grain of a structure that has an unbending or unyielding nature. And yet stories of critical disruptions of the status quo are not only told in the form of tree bark. I want to take us from timber to timbre, from the quality of trees to the texture of voice, because voice matters in systems of power. The panel painting reverberates with a particular tone. Looking closely, we find a saying or motto below the shield of the coat of arms just above Henry VIII's head. It reads, Dieu est mon droit, or God in my right, which communicates the divine right of kings or the doctrine that a monarch's authority is above any earthly influence or consent. It is said that this phrase was first uttered as a battle call in the 12th century. It remains the motto of the British monarchy. Caribbean people would make their own battle calls, talking back in an expression of their rights as human beings. Letters from subjugated peoples in the Caribbean flowed in waves from colony to colonizer. churning, swirling, and foaming to rock the boat, so to speak. Toussaint Louverture's Constitution of 1801 outlined new rights and laws for Haitian people. This document was accompanied by a letter to the French Minister of Marine and the Colonies upholding ideas of freedom. In a preceding wave, Maroon leader Jean-François Papillon, alongside Georges Bessou and Belair, wrote a letter to the Colonial Assembly in 1792. It reads in part, and I quote, "Under the blows of your barbarous whip, we have accumulated for you the treasures you enjoy in this colony. For too long we have borne your chains without thinking of shaking them off. But any authority which is not founded on virtue and humanity, and which only tends to subject one's fellow man to slavery, must come to an end, and that end is yours." End quote. A letter written earlier in 1789 serves as another notable wave of correspondence. Signed the entire nation of Martinique. The document addressed to the Grand General declares, and I quote, "The entire nation of black slaves united together has a single wish, a single desire for independence, and all the slaves with a unanimous voice send out only one cry, one clamor, to reclaim the liberty they have gained through centuries of suffering and ignominious servitude. This is no longer a nation that is blinded by ignorance and that trembles at the threat of the lightest punishment. Its suffering has enlightened it and has determined it to spill to its last drop of blood rather than support the yoke of slavery." End quote. Voices therefore become a tidal cycle or rhythm in revolutionary acts that trouble the tonal color of colonial articulations. Now, why have I taken us on a seeming detour through the past? What does this all have to do with how we care for museum collections? That is, how we think about their composition in our current age. Well, we are still grappling with legacies of the past, compelling us, and I'm adopting Derek Walcott's words here, to quote, "conjugate both tenses simultaneously, the past and the present." End quote. We can learn from the entangled histories and ongoing encounters between the Caribbean and Europe. Caring, therefore, looks like allowing museum collections akin to the mighty oak to buckle. Care has to go beyond preservation, protection, and safekeeping. Care also has a sound. I propose a return to an early connotation of the word care. Before it evolved into what we understand it to be today, to care meant to call. It suggested something to be voiced, a vocalization, a sounding. This meaning has value for us in the present because it is a provocation for us to care for museum collections in such a way that we allow a range of representation, a range of voices, a call that echoes the sea. To illuminate my point, let me go back to the lines in Kamau Brathwaite's poem that I shared earlier in this talk. He says, "By these shores I was born, sound of the sea came in at my window." As a Caribbean poet, Brathwaite was very interested in voice, in vocalizations that were not muffled or muted by the full-throated efforts of empire. In 1991, Brathwaite appeared in the first recording of a video series spotlighting Caribbean writers and their art. In the interview, he shares, quote, "When I was growing up in Barbados, I was right there on the beach, and my birth was coincident with the sound of the sea. So that if I had to have a rhythm, that rhythm should have been the sea song, but instead of which I had the rhythm of English poet John Keats in my head." End quote. He wanted, as he describes it, the syncopation of the waves. A museum collection with a syncopated rhythm is one with tension. It goes offbeat. It takes unexpected turns. Care is about allowing the collection to have a certain call, a sea-song that challenges the stable pitch and volume of acquisitions. This is the Tidalectic endeavor. It is care as tending to, making tense. Care as stretching so that there is an opening up. Inclusion is the opposite. To include is to shut in, to close, or imprison. The question then is not how to make collections inclusive, but rather how to listen to museum collections with an ear for breaking rhythmic patterns. This question understands belonging not as fitting in, but as a state of being perpetually without finality. It understands what it means to make a home on the waves. With this dialectic sense, the aesthetics of distortion and unfamiliarity in artworks by Stanton Taylor and Rodel Warner have the potential to warp presumptions held fast in historic collections. The implied rock and sway in Felicia Caranage's installation destabilizes representation. Ryan Huggins's work moves us back and forth between the surface and interior of narratives. Simone Kennedy Doig's paintings draw us to the motion of memory. Shannon Alonso's watercolor images postpone rootedness in favor of fluidity. And Giovanna Hadid's work is a monumental openness that makes room for what resides in the tension of the painful and the comforting, in what is both raw and soft. Like the old woman Kamau Brathwaite witnessed, our approach to museum collections cannot be one-off events. We must always be on a journey, walking on water from one shore to another, listening, sweeping, tending, constantly making ripples, declaring we are here. All of us are here. We're at a breaking point in this lecture. We find ourselves at the shore again, but I trust you hear them, that you feel them coming. Waves, more waves. Let us look to the horizon with expectation. I want to end at the beginning, which is to say at the start, that is the end, which is to say the beginning, that is the end, that is the beginning. Thank you.